welcome back. It is Monday. I am Mr. Sesotris, and this week we're going to be talking about magical realism. This is a genre that I love deeply, but it's really hard to kind of pin down sometimes. It's very ephemeral, and it kind of exists in a very specific place, and it's one of those things where you can recognize it, but it's a little bit more difficult to describe it. So I'm going to do my best. Magical realism in recent years has been kind of hard to pin down. I know there's always that famous quote by, who was it? Terry Pratchett, who said, "Writing magical realism is like a polite way of saying you write fantasy and is more acceptable to certain people." I think Terry Pratchett was being a bit cheeky when he said that. He didn't really have anything against magical realism, but it kind of leads people to think that the definition of it is sort of tricky. Is it fantasy? Is it not? What's the deal? What's the moment of change when something stops being fantasy and starts being magical realism? And going back to kind of the historical stuff, magical realism is very much a response to realism and modernism. So the early 20th century, a lot of like old paradigms were sort of crumbling, and people were trying to find a new way of organizing things. And so modernism kind of sought to find kind of new ways of doing things, and that's where you get things like surrealism and, you know, cubism and stream of conscious novels and ballets like The Rite of Spring, which is very atonal, and just everyone is kind of trying to find, you know, what's the new way of doing things. There's a poet, Ezra Pound, there we go, who said that, you know, the whole point of modernism is like, you know, make it new. And so they're always trying to kind of find new ways of doing things. And so out of that you get surrealism, where you get kind of strange things as a way to kind of get people thinking about, you know, the way things used to be. It was kind of meant to challenge the brain. And so in response to that, you get magical realism, which is very much a postmodern genre, and it's also very post-colonial too. And it grew out of South America, very much in kind of mid-century South America. So that's like, you got the Cold War going on and all that stuff. And the thing with magical realism is that there are fantastical elements, but they're not seen as unusual or out of place by the characters. They just sort of are there. And it's not that they're living in a fantasy world. Magical realism is very much concerned with reality. You know, it's telling brutally real, grounded stories about real things that real people face. A lot of times they're historical or they're contemporary, but the fantastical elements sort of exist in the background, very much as a way to kind of metaphorically enhance the story and relate to kind of what the characters are feeling. But like, the characters never look at things and be like, oh wow, that's magical, you know, that's so cool. They just kind of accept it as something that goes on in the background. They're living in a very tumultuous, chaotic world, and so when something fantastical happens, like, you know, a dog grows to the size of like a bear, everyone's just kind of like, oh, now you have to deal with this dog that's enormous. Like, if you ask someone in a magical realist novel, if you point at something magical and say, why is it doing that? They would just be like, that's just the way things are. What, you're being crazy. So it's very much, the focus is never on the magic. It's on the reality and the real life struggles the characters are going through. But the magical elements kind of exist in the background. They're kind of the backdrop of everything, if that makes sense. Magical realism is really interesting because the magic in it is never codified. You'll never have a character looking for kind of the source of the magic, or you'll never find someone like seeking to fix something magical. I like to bring up, you know, the movie Encanto, which is very much a love letter to that aesthetic, to like the South American magical realists, but Encanto is very much a fantasy film. It's a gorgeous one, and there's lots of winks at kind of the conventions of magical realism, but at the heart of the story, there's a magical problem to be solved, and the characters have to find it. Now, the solving of the problem is an emotional one, so it is about kind of human relationships and everything, but like the magic is a little too fantastic in that one to be considered completely magical realism. Now, it's really close, but the magic is the focus. Like, everyone's like, there's rules to the magic. You know, the members of this family, when they reach a certain age, they get magical powers that are related to, you know, these doors in this house, and if they, you know, if something happens to disrupt that, then they don't get magical powers. And so there's still rules to the magic. In magical realism, there's no specific rules to the magic. It's kind of like folklore, where, you know, for example, you'll have a story where maybe a character kills a giant, and they use the giant's bones to create like a mountain range, you know, something like that, where it's like, logically it doesn't really make sense, but when you're reading it, you're just like, oh yeah, obviously, you know, that's just accepted. And so with magical realism, there's that folkloric quality to it, but it's still very rooted in the realistic struggles of what's going on. The magic is just sort of something that happens. It's kind of an outgrowth of what's going on. There's a book called Like Water for Chocolate by Laura Esquivel. And in that one, the main character just... her emotional state while she's cooking influences the people who eat her food. So, for example, there's one part where she's devastated and she's crying, and her tears fall into the dough as she's making something. But then when she serves the food, it makes everybody violently sick, and it's like her inner pain is kind of transferred to everyone else. And she doesn't say, oh, look, I have the power to influence people with my cooking. She just kind of is like, oh, I'm so frustrated that this happened, kind of thing. It's not, there's no looking at it as kind of an unusual, strange thing. And so this genre came from kind of South America. The term originated in Germany in the 1920s, but it was used to describe like visual art, like paintings. But magical realism as a literary genre started in South America, and it was like mid-century, like mid-20th century, and that's when like the Cold War was going on. The Western powers were interfering in a lot of the governments because they didn't want communism to take hold, and so they propped up fascist governments or conservative governments, and there was a lot of manipulation. So things changed quite a bit. There was revolution, there was uncertainty about the future, and so you've got these characters who are facing upheaval, change, and chaos kind of in their real lives, and magical realism is a way to sort of explain that chaos. There's also ties to like indigenous folklore, and it's sort of just a way, people living in just a chaotic world that they can't understand, and so the magical elements kind of enhance that. And so the magical elements are meant to showcase the real plight of people living in South America in this time, when, you know, governments rise and fall. You never know who's going to be in charge. It's very tenuous and chaotic. So I have two texts here, and I'm going to ask a question and then we'll kind of answer it at a later time. But I've got two texts that they both exist outside of kind of the magical realism genre, but one is probably closer to that genre and the other is very much not. And so I want to just give you some time to think about which one you think fits into that genre a little better. The first is Hamlet. And the second is Beloved by Toni Morrison. Now, both stories feature a ghost. Both stories are rooted in realistic settings with realistic characters. It's Circe. She likes Hamlet. One of them fits better into the magical realist bubble, and one of them is very much not. So we'll talk about this later, but just think about it. You know, both have a ghost, and both are realistic, but why is one more magical realist than the other? We'll get back to that a little bit later. So magical realism is a response to earlier genres like surrealism. I'm thinking of Salvador Dali, although Salvador Dali was a fascist, so I'm not a huge fan of him. But that kind of thing, the kind of strange imagery, rebelling against established norms, stuff like that. And magical realism is very much rooted in the struggles of kind of the Latin American people during this time of upheaval, and the surrealist kind of influenced the magical realists in a way. So like surrealism is kind of a modernist, somewhat postmodern genre, or it's more like a movement. It's like an art movement. And then magical realism is very much a postmodern movement. And so, for example, you've got Franz Kafka's The Metamorphosis, where a character wakes up one day and suddenly he's just a giant bug. He's a giant beetle. And he just has to kind of live his life that way, and it's very sad, and everyone rejects him, and that's very much a surrealist story. It's kind of commenting on isolation and everything, but that was very influential to Gabriel Garcia Marquez, who kind of took that and said, if you can have this kind of stuff in literature, then why not? And so he wanted to write a book about like his family's house. And then adding in this kind of fantastical element that became 100 Years of Solitude, which is kind of one of the big seminal classics of the genre. During the 1960s and 70s, Latin America was in a period of political turmoil because of diplomatic strategies created by the Cold War. Writers in the region became unified around a common desire for nationalization after the Cuban Revolution in 1959, when the eyes of the world turned to Latin America. One of the hallmarks of the Latin American boom and the popularity of the novels within this time period was the use of magical realism. Now you can see this in kind of the most famous kind of novels of the period. Both 100 Years of Solitude by Gabriel Garcia Marquez and The House of the Spirits by Isabel Allende both follow families over a long period of time. They both look at kind of how characters react to upheaval and change and growth, evolution, adaptation, as they have to kind of fit into this chaotic world that they're living in. Now, because magical realism is essentially a post-colonial genre, you can see it outside of South America. And so you have seen authors like Salman Rushdie with Midnight's Children, or Louise Erdrich, who wrote a couple books that can be classified as magical realists, like Tracks, because you get the characters who are caught in between worlds, where there's sort of the colonizer and the colonized, and that crash of worldviews. In something like The House of the Spirits, you've got a character. There's a priest in one of the earlier chapters, who's he's very zealous and crazy and decries demons and everything, but he's very much linked with kind of like the establishment, and it's very clear that he's kind of out of touch with reality. And so in later books, when they're outside of South America, you get that same kind of conflict. In Midnight's Children, it's set in India, right after kind of India gains its independence from England, and then you've got like the partition and all that stuff happening at the same time. With Louise Erdrich, you've got events set in kind of an Anishinaabe reservation in early 20th century North America, in North Dakota. And so you've got these kind of characters there's this kind of blending between sort of the beliefs of the colonized and the influence of the colonizer, and the sense of instability that brings, where you find your own culture kind of being attacked by an outside one. And so there's this kind of crash between sort of magical elements and realistic elements that works really well. And it's the same kind of thing as in South American magical realism, but it's just filtered through kind of a different worldview, which is really cool. A careful analysis of Tracks and The Plague of Doves reveals that Erdrich employs magical realism in a fashion similar to other magical realists. The supernatural is used as a form of resistance to colonialism and colonial worldviews. Now, in more recent years, magical realism's definition has gotten a bit squishier, with books like Ian Martell's The Life of Pi and Neil Gaiman's The Ocean at the End of the Lane being sometimes categorized as magical realism. And they're not quite, but I can kind of see why people would see that. With Life of Pi, it does have that kind of folkloric quality and heightened reality, but there's two versions of reality that the book kind of shows the reader. There's kind of the dreamlike, more adventuresome story that's much cooler and magical and everything, and then there's kind of the more brutal reality that it's sort of describing, and it's sort of saying, which version of reality do you prefer? Now, in magical realism, the magical elements are a part of reality. They're not sort of an alternative to reality, if that makes sense. So the magical element should kind of enhance the real events that happen, rather than acting as kind of like a dreamlike escape from the real. Now, in terms of Ocean at the End of the Lane, this is very much a fantasy. It still does have that kind of fairy tale folklore quality, but it's about the magic. You've got kind of a magical force that comes into the real world and endangers the main character, and so the main character has to kind of fight this ancient evil that sort of grows out of kind of the real world. And so the focus is on defeating the magic thing. It's not, it is kind of metaphorically linked to sort of what the main character is going through, but the focus is on the magic. You know, you've got witches at one point who kind of help him out. So the focus in magical realism is not the magic, it's not using magic, it's not facing off against magic. It's facing very real, like the real drudgery of real life. And there's no sense of like using magic. If someone has a magical ability, it just sort of kind of happens. For example, in the House of the Spirits, there's a character who seems to have some kind of mystical connection, and occasionally she'll say things like, oh, something wrong is going to happen, and then something happens. But it's not a part of the story. Her powers are not the focus of the story. It's just sort of something that makes her kind of feel detached from the rest of the people. But the story itself is a very realistic and rooted one. I've got cats all around me here, so pardon if like the camera shakes. So returning back to Hamlet and Beloved, do you have kind of a sense of which one is closer to magical realism than the other? Now, if you said Beloved, you would be correct. Beloved is a story rooted in reality. The focus is Setha's journey, and the very real, tangible legacy of slavery. So the ghost is a part of the story, but the ghost comes out of kind of Setha's emotional journey, and is a reflection of the things that she's tried to escape in her past, some really horrible things that she's been trying to kind of bury in her memory. So in this one, now Toni Morrison herself has kind of said that she doesn't really feel that this is completely magical realist, which I can understand. This definitely fits more into like American Gothic or Southern Gothic, but the way that it treats the fantastical elements is more in keeping with magical realism than Hamlet. Now, with Hamlet, the ghost is very much part of kind of convention and orthodoxy. The audience at that time would have absolutely believed in ghosts. And also the ghost kind of exists as a result of the rules that they kind of all would have known. It's tied up in kind of the version of Christian mythology that they were kind of most connected to at that time. So, Hamlet's father is killed before he's able to repent or pray or whatever, and so he gets stuck in purgatory, and so he comes back to Earth to implore Hamlet to kind of seek revenge for him so that his soul can kind of move on. And the audience would have known that. And even the characters in the play sort of address that fact. They talk about sort of strange things that happened when Julius Caesar was killed. And they talk about how, sometimes the dead would rise from the grave. And that was just kind of a thing that happened. So it's not... the magical elements are not sort of a part of the backdrop coming out of sort of metaphorical... needs, although the ghost is a very kind of metaphorical thing, but the magical elements don't have the same folkloric quality. The ghost is kind of dramatic shorthand, so when the ghost shows up at the beginning, the audience would have already known, okay, so because there's a ghost, that means something wrong happened and something needs to be fixed, because it's all about restoring order. Things are, like the quote, things are rotten in the state of Denmark. So because Hamlet's father was killed, he was the king, so when the king is killed, the natural order of things kind of is off kilter, and it needs to be fixed. And so the focus is on kind of like, it's all part of this kind of fantastical framework, but there's rules to it, and the audience would have known those rules because it would have been part of kind of their own experience with things. And so now, for example, if the story had been where Hamlet discovers that his father was killed by more mundane means, and then maybe the ghost appeared here and there to sort of chide him for not acting sooner, then I could see that maybe feeling more magical realist. But in this case, the ghost is the catalyst for the story. It's a focus point, and so the fantastical elements, the ghost exists because the natural order has been disrupted and it needs to be fixed. And it wouldn't have been seen as necessary fantasy by the audience of the day. To end this video, I hope this wasn't too chaotic. It's a little kind of hard to put into words sometimes. But to end this video, I want to give just a really brief list of some authors and works you should check out if you're interested in reading more magical realist works. There's obviously a ton more than the ones that I'm going to mention here, but we'll just go there. So we've got Gabriel Garcia Marquez. He was Colombian. 100 Years of Solitude is kind of his magnum opus, but there's others. There's the novel Love in the Time of Cholera. There's the short story The Handsomest Drowned Man in the World. There's lots of other stuff of his that you can kind of check out. Here we go. Isabel Allende is Chilean. So House of the Spirits is kind of one of her most famous ones, but she's written a ton of other stuff. Absolutely gorgeous writer. I'm reading this one currently because I love it. So yeah, she's another one you should definitely check out. Another one, he writes short stories, but that's Jorge Luis Borges, and he's from Argentina. Oh my God, that's terrible. He's from Argentina, or was, and his stories are short stories, but he's also a really cool writer. We've got Laura Esquivel. She's Mexican. Her book, Like Water for Chocolate, is an absolutely gorgeous, wonderful, magical realist story. And I also just learned she is a politician now. Like, she serves in like the Mexican government, which is really cool. So like, that's pretty awesome. There's also Salman Rushdie. He's Indian-born British American. Midnight's Children is kind of his big magical realist novel, but I think he's also explored it in some of his other works. There's also the Japanese writer Haruki Murakami. I don't know if his stuff is technically magical realist, but he uses magical realist elements in his works. Now, I haven't read any of his works, but he definitely comes up in lists of kind of contemporary magical realist authors, so he's definitely one to check out. I do want to read his stuff eventually when I get through all this other stuff that I have to read, but he's definitely a good one to check out. So that's magical realism in a very chaotic nutshell. That's all I have for this week. In the meantime, I hope you enjoy your week, and I will see you next week. Bye.